Start.
Yes, Nathan, we are live now.
Are we live now? Okay, excellent. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Atin Biswas, and I work with Center for Science and Environment. This webinar is being co-hosted by Grid Arendal, Norway, the Norwegian Institute of Water Research, NIVA, and CSE. So this is basically the third and the last one in the series of webinar that we organized around the INC. Just for a quick context, you all know that the historic resolution 514 was adopted in the United Nations Environment Assembly meeting 5.2 back in March 2022 to develop an internationally legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. And subsequently, with this resolution, the INC, or the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, was formed with all UN member states to arrive at a global plastic treaty. Considering the scale of plastic production and consumption globally, this resolution recognized that addressing plastic pollution cannot be achieved merely by looking at it as a waste management problem. Rather, the treaty recognized that focusing on the full life cycle of plastic should be the priority. In the last 993 3 days, I'm counting these numbers since the first INC in Punta del Este till the one that we had recently in Geneva. So we had 6 rounds of negotiation in the 993 days, but the fate of treaty remains unknown. The deadline that the UNIA set for itself has already ended in 2024. And the whole world was eagerly looking at the second session of the fifth INC, or known as the INC 5.2, that recently concluded in Geneva, Switzerland on the morning of 15th August. But the negotiation was unsuccessful again. So in today's webinar, we shall look back and try to analyze why INC 5.2 was unsuccessful to deliver the treaty. What was the geopolitical discourse that basically led to this failure? And we'll also try to deconstruct the discussion with the help of a pool of celebrated practitioners that we have today. And we'll introduce them to all of you just ahead of the panel discussion. Just for a quick housekeeping, we'll start the discussion with a very short presentation by my senior colleague Siddharth to take us through the INC journey so far and also talk about the highlights of 5.2 in Geneva and what went wrong. We shall then invite the panelists to reflect on the INC 5.2 with their perspectives and expertises. Basically, we're going to ask them specific questions as well. We'll then open up the floor for questions from all of you. So I request you to start posting your question, ideally in the Q&A box, so that it is easier for us to pick up. We shall also share the link to download the presentation and all the other materials that basically we have developed and released in the last 1.5 months once the discussion starts. So let me stop here now and request Siddharth to take over and make the presentation, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Atin. I'll just quickly share my screen. So I will very quickly take you through like the basic background behind how we reached at 5.2, what kind of happened in the 10-day long negotiation. I think this was one of the longest in the INC series, especially for the ending plastic pollution. So it all started, like Atin said, with the UNIA 5.2 resolution 5/14, which basically mandated the formation of a committee and then also developing a text, a legally binding text to address the issue of plastic pollution. Since then, including the Geneva meeting, we had 7 meetings, right? So it started with the OEWG in Dakar, and then with INC1, and then we were at 5.2 in Geneva. Now, why am I sharing this with you is because if any of you have been following the process, and if you look at the very first set of I would say, options for elements paper. I mean, it had, as some people said, it had all the dreams, all the ambitions, but it also had all the nightmares of how a treaty actually could look like. And since INC 1 till INC 5.2, what we've seen is a steady decline in the level of ambition that the committee is looking at, right? So the committee is more than 175 member states. They've met 7 times, and every time they meet, we see that there is a dip in the level of ambition that we really want to see in the final text. Uh, so as most of you know, and as Atin mentioned, we were supposed to finalize and adopt this legally binding text back in December 2024. That was the deadline. But we are already close to 250 days past that deadline, and we are nowhere close to having a text that is legally binding and addresses the full life cycle of plastic. Now, what was agreed in the Busan meeting, or the fifth INC, was that the chair had tabled a text which is referred to as the chair's text, and it was released on the 1st of December 2024, after most of the negotiations in Busan had kind of concluded. And the committee had also decided that this would be the basis of negotiations as we move ahead from Busan to the next meeting. Um, Now, this, what you see on the left, is all the articles that the chair's text had, right? So it started with preamble and scope, and then went on to have 32 more articles which talked about the objectives, the principles, definitions, what kind of bans could we be looking at, what kind of exemptions could be there, should we talk about supply or not, what kind of obligatory nature would be on the member states to manage plastic waste, so on and so forth, including reporting, including financing, and including what kind of powers would the future COP have. Um, for probably the first time in Geneva, uh, a lot of member states actually came forward and they talked about, having a package, right? And while the chair's text itself is it is a balanced text, but it still has a lot of brackets, which means there's a lot of elements that still need to be agreed upon. But a lot of countries actually spoke about a package, which means that these are a few articles which are non-negotiable in order to have a legally binding text, which is actually implementable, right? So what are these articles? This is Article 3, which talks about global bans on selected problematic single-use plastics. It's Article 5 that, so basically, if you look at Article 3, I mean, it's basically things that we don't want. I mean, we can continue to live even without these, right? Article 5 is something that would still be allowed for circulation, but it needs to be designed better so that it stays longer in the circular economy loop, and it also forms a part of the non-toxic circular economy that we keep talking about. It's not just about circular economy, it's also about a non-toxic circular economy. A lot of countries spoke about the importance of having Article 6, which puts a lot of emphasis on plastic production cuts with targets, and also the importance of sharing data on production, plastic production, on consumption of plastics, and also on waste generation. Um, Article 11, which talks about means of implementation or finance, is a very important part of this package, which basically ensures that especially developing countries and with special considerations for small island developing states, for least developed countries, there is timely, adequate, and accessible financing that is available for them to implement the modalities of this treaty as we move ahead. And the last part of this package is a conference of parties that has the ability to take decisions, something that has been consistently, I mean, the chair, the secretariat has been constantly being reminded of how important this is. So this is what a lot of countries took the floor to actually say that these articles are non-negotiable and they have to find their place in the final text that this committee actually adopts, and then member states start to ratify before they become parties. Now, a lot of countries tried to utilize the time they had between the Busan meeting in November 2024 and the Geneva meeting in August 2025. So they utilized these 8 months to actually come up with very strong proposals. And all of these proposals were basically strengthening the package that these countries were talking about, right? So if you look at the first one, so this proposal by Peru and Colombia, it basically was a proposal on Article 20, and it had received support from close to 120 countries of the 175 that, or the 178 that were attending this meeting. And what this uh, proposal basically talked about is that in in the absence of consensus, the committee or the future conference of parties should have the ability to vote. And it has different thresholds for substantive issues, which means what kinds of products should we ban, whether or not we should have or talk about production cuts, what kind of guidance is needed for developing, or standardizing or harmonizing plastic design. These are all substantive issues. How do we move ahead? What is the process that we should follow in this negotiation? That those are procedural issues, which again has a different threshold as per this particular proposal. It enjoyed, I mean, more than two-third majority support. Now, the other very important, and again, a part of the package proposal was put forth by Switzerland and Mexico. It was again supported by 89 countries. So a very strong proposal which talked about having a criteria for identifying problematic single-use plastic products, including plastic products that have chemicals of concern. It also talked about formation of subsidiary bodies for the flow of information from the scientific community to these spaces where such decisions could be made. And it also housed an initial list, which basically talks about very basic items which actually are banned in a lot of developing countries as well. One of the examples is carry bags, um, earbuds, cutleries, etc., etc. So very basic, I would say a low-hanging fruit. And then there was another part of the package was put forth by UK and Chile, supported by 33 countries, and talked about what kind of guidance do we need going forward when if we want to harmonize our plastic products better, because the design of plastic products is very closely linked to your waste management infrastructure. So if you have a standardized product design, investing in waste management infrastructure on the downstream becomes very easy. But due to the technical nature of this article, it did not receive a lot of support. And it's also kind of slightly far-sighted, I would say, because there's a lot of technicalities and a lot of modalities that would kind of need to be worked upon before we start kind of digging deeper into this particular article. So of the six different articles that are very important for the package. These three were basically the bridge building proposals that, although the proponents were two countries each, but they had kind of consulted several countries while they were developing these proposals. And that's how more and more countries came forward and supported these proposals. Now, while all of this happened, I mean, we as you know, there were four different contact groups. Two of them were constantly running in parallel. There were different issues being discussed. I would say finance was one contact group which made a lot of progress. Actually, we had a text coming from the co-chair, which actually got I would say it received a lot of support from colleagues in the room, but there were issues in other contact groups which continued to discuss on Article 3, which is about global bans. They continued to discuss about Article 5 without a lot of movement. Um, After 8 days of negotiation that started on the 5th, finally on the 13th of August, we had the first uh, chair's proposal. And after it was basically tabled, we also had the stock take plenary that Saturday. And this proposal was basically, it did not challenge the status quo that we are in. It basically said that let things continue as they are, but let's have a treaty around what we are doing, right? Um, it was rejected by more than 80 countries in the room, while some were actually willing to work with it, most were not. And then what basically happened after that is anybody's guess, right? Because all of it was happening behind closed door in informals or informals, and it kept getting more and more opaque. And finally, on the 15th of August, we had post midnight, we had the chair's revised text proposal, which had some interesting elements, but it was not ambitious enough for any of the countries to move ahead, and it was not it did not please the like-minded countries either, because it had some elements that made them uncomfortable. So to basically summarize before I hand it back to Atin, uh, the 13th August chair's proposal faced a very wide rejection by most of the countries that were there in the room. Only a handful from the like-minded countries actually came forward and expressed their desire to continue with this as the basis of the negotiations, but the majority of the people in the room did not accept that. The 15th August proposal again did not do a lot to improve the package that we just discussed about, the non-negotiable package. But it also did have some very interesting elements, although not as ambitious as we would like to see. But on Article 20 on COP, for the first time, the chair actually explored whether the COP would have voting rights, although the threshold limits were slightly higher for both substantive and for procedural issues. But there was an inclusion and the possibility of voting. Now, what basically happened is an 5.2 meeting ended very abruptly, right? I mean, we were looking at some interventions from observers. We were hoping to kind of get the momentum moving again with some kind of hope, but it was an abrupt end after a couple of member states kind of intervened and kind of forced the chair to gavel. But right now, where we are today is we do not have a very clear path on when this committee will meet, if this committee will meet, and where this committee will meet, right? So all of that right now is absolutely unknown. But we also know that both the proposals that were put forth by the chair have been rejected by the committee, which basically takes us back to the chair's text that was tabled on the 1st December 2024, accepted by the committee as the basis of the negotiations. So whenever this committee meets, the chair's text from the 1st of December 2024 will continue to be the basis of negotiations moving forward. So, I mean, it would not be very wise to say that, but we are pretty much where we started off, where we left off in Busan, and in terms of progress, I don't see. I would rate Busan slightly better than what we saw in Geneva. So that's it from my side, and I'll just hand it back to Atin.
Yeah, thank you, Sid. So it's time to bring in the panelists, but before we invite the panelists to speak, let me just quickly introduce all of them to you. We have with us Dr. Bethany Kearney-Almont. Dr. Bethany is a professor of ecotoxicology at the Department of Biology and Environmental Sciences, University of Gothenburg, Sweden, with 30 years of experience in studying the impacts of pollution in aquatic environments. This work spans from molecular mechanism to planetary scale impacts. She also coordinates the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. Then we have Lars Tordal. Lars is strategic lead, external relations and policy, and thematic lead, plastic pollution in Grid Arendal is a civil society organization in Norway. Lars is responsible for developing and delivering policy-oriented projects and capacity building to eliminate plastic pollution. He's passionate about process that helps countries find solution to land-based pollution and environmental and social challenges. Lars lead Grid Arendal's collaboration with UNEP on plastic pollution, supporting initiatives like GPML digital platform and INC process. He holds a Master of Science in Engineering from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Then we have Siddharth. We have just heard him. Siddharth is a program manager, is my colleague in CSE. He has a master's degree in green technology from the Institute of Chemical Technology, Mumbai. With nearly a decade of experience in solid waste management, he co-founded a social enterprise for organic waste management. Siddharth works with the Solid Waste Management and Circular Economy Unit, focusing on plastic pollution. He has been involved in government committees contributing to policy development on plastic waste management and circularity. Siddharth leads CS's plastic initiative and has been following the Global Plastic Treaty since the OEWG meeting in Dakar, Senegal. Then we have Christopher Gronstein. He's a senior advisor in the Norwegian Institute of Water Research, NIVA, and special advisor to China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, CCICED. He has previously served as counselor at Norway's embassies in China and Indonesia, and as senior advisor at the Norwegian Environment Agency and the Ministry of Climate and Environment. And last but not the least, we have Madhuvanti R. She's a consultant. Her expertise in international law and policy. She's a lawyer with a background in law, political science, and public international law. She has experience in sexual offenses and child abuse survivors, environmental governance, and climate action. She has conducted data-driven analysis of state-level policies, contributed to waste management policy drafting, and led grassroots campaign for climate justice. She has participated in global trade and health policy discussions, including the TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 vaccines. She is now an independent international law and policy consultant advising civil society and governments across the Asia Pacific and beyond. So I just wanted to thank all the panelists for taking out the time and joining us. Before we get to the specifics, I have a common question for all the panelists, and I would request to kind of restrict your initial reaction to just about a couple of minutes. So we all know that Geneva is a big chance that we have lost. Now, in your opinion, what do you recognize as the defining moment which basically led to this collapse, if I may say so? I mean, I can start with Bethany and the others can take turns. Over to you.
I'm going to look at it as a good thing from this perspective of a scientist, given that the options that were on the table would likely not have been effective in achieving the goals or the mandate of the resolution. And we did hear a number of countries state on the floor that they were rejecting the the draft based on the fact that it did not align with the evidence and did not align with science. And as I was attending these meetings together with the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, with the goal of bringing robust, independent science and evidence to decision makers to ground their negotiations in, I think from that perspective, I was happy to hear negotiators relying on science, referring to the triple planetary crisis, referring to where evidence is pointing as essential obligations for the treaty to fulfill its mandate. So it collapsed, but I think it collapsed for one of the reasons. It maybe collapse was for a good reason.
All right, that's very interesting. Okay, Lars.
Okay, thanks, Satin. Thanks for having me. I think I'm also slightly leaning more optimistically than in your introduction. This is not over yet, and in fact, I think history is full of examples of treaty making processes that have taken a lot more time than this process. So I think we need to remember that the timeline that was set out in Resolution 514 was extremely ambitious. That said, of course, I think we are faced with a challenge, and Siddharth explained it very well, in the fact that the draft rules of procedure are not fully agreed. There's a particular challenge around voting and an insistence on an extreme insistence on consensus-based decision making. So that means that I mean, of course, any number of countries, a small number of countries, can hold the process hostage, by insisting on consensus. On the other hand, of course, it also means that, as Bethany has explained, that those countries that want ambition can also, sort of push for that through a consensus-based negotiation process. I don't think we can point to a specific defining moments during INC 5.2 other than to sort of look at the fact that some countries actually negotiate in bad faith. They are quite happy with the status quo. They don't need, they don't even want some of them a treaty. And the chair's efforts to produce new texts sort of were, I mean, coming from a good point, but it's probably too little, too late, if you want to put a fine point on it. So there just weren't any concrete landing zones in that sense. But as I said, I mean, it's not over yet, and I think we just need to remain hopeful in the time ahead. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Siddharth.
So for me, Atin, personally, I would say that there is what I saw is that the chair and the co-chair, I mean, they did not have enough power, and they were in the line of firing, right? So I would say that it may be the case that both the co-chair and the chair were kind of influenced by the idea of both consensus as well as the most vocal countries in the room, right? Traditionally, I'm not talking specifically about 5.2, I'm talking about traditionally who has been the most vocal in the room. And that is the pressure that both the chair and the co-chair were very aware of. But they were also under pressure to kind of, have something from this round of discussions. We all know the pressure that UNEP had to deliver something, right? So I think that desperation plus the the limitations in terms of the tools that they had at their disposal basically led us to the chair proposing what many are literally calling that, the lowest common denominator, which is far away from any kind of ambition, and it basically promotes status quo, which is what we really want to move away from. So that's my initial reactions, I would say. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So the chair and co-chair could have played a different role. Okay. Very interesting. Okay. Christopher, quick remarks.
Thank you for the kind invitation to join. My voice is still recovering from Geneva, but I'm very happy to be with you and for this chance to re-engage with CSE. I have fond memories from working with you in the past and from visiting you in Delhi. When it comes to defining moments, I think Siddharth had an excellent wrap up. I was actually quite optimistic in the beginning of this IMC. The member states didn't start with long procedural discussions. They dived directly into contact groups. So I had the feeling that many of the countries came there to work and to try to achieve something. I think the co-chairs in the working groups worked really well also. Must have been quite exhausting. But then the dip in ambition that Siddharth talked about became visible in those contact groups, I would say more and more. And one thing that concerned me at that time was there didn't seem to be a coordinated response from the countries that want to stick to the mandate from UNEA. I would have liked that they had been standing up much better and more coordinated and with authority to point out very clearly where the mandate is. I think that would have been very helpful. And the longer that we walked without solutions, without text being presented by the contact groups to the plenary, because there was also no plenary, at least I kept getting a feeling of a lack of direction and also a bit of lack of energy, which I think would have been needed to take us over the finish line. I recognize that the party still tried hard, also after the ministers started arriving. And that could have been a defining moment, but I felt that that was also a little bit of a missed opportunity. I attended a press conference, which seemed not that well prepared, actually, from one of the ambitious ministers, I would say. So, and then, yeah, you had maybe, I think the new text proposals, they were also, they would have been an opportunity to add energy to this, but without any ownership amongst important countries in the negotiations, I don't think it was possible for the chair to push us over the finish line with that. So yeah, it started very positive, but then it ended on a not so great note.
Yeah. Completely agree with you, Christopher, especially on the 13th morning when the 13th plenary, when the chair's text proposal was available. Obviously, I mean, many member states took the floor and they clearly rejected the proposal, saying that it is a major deviation from the resolution 514. So, okay, very interesting perspectives. Now, Madhu.
Thank you, Atin, and thank you, CSC, for having me here today. I might have a slightly different take on this because, yes, we do all agree that this was a critical round because, as Siddharth said, this was beyond the UNEA 514 mandates deadline. We were essentially negotiating on borrowed time and borrowed money. But where I would slightly differ is that the first few days, which were seen as optimistic by many, I think I differ there because it was the modality which was more concerning for me. Like the first 4 days, we did directly dive into the contact group discussions, but for me, I found that the contact group modality was lacking because it added more complexities instead of clarity, where we should have started with the chair's text from Busan, removing brackets. We were adding more and more text. And even in the CGs, we could see that countries largely maintained their hardline positions instead of trying to find areas of convergence. And I think the widespread frustration was quite evident among states, irrespective of whether they agree or disagree on substance or procedure. Everyone was frustrated that we were losing valuable negotiating time while being stuck in the same modality. So I do see it differently that way. And some of the other defining moments, I would say, was the stocktake plenary, which happened on Saturday, which in my opinion shifted the dynamics considerably or visibly, because countries whom we've seen previously who have been ambiguous or very closeted about their positions, they came out quite strongly, publicly aligning themselves with other country groupings. And we also saw some countries which were, were dilly-dallying about their positions earlier, become very vocal about their hardline positions at the stock take plenary. And another point which Siddharth mentioned that I wanted to add on to was there were surprising moments where CG3 on finance and CG4 showed considerable progress. Like they made some headway compared to CG1 and 2. On a lighter note, like a colleague asked me at one point if mentioned that I looked surprisingly cheerful on that particular day, and I joked it was because I attended CG3 and 4 instead of 1 and 2. So yeah, so like on a personal note. And finally, one other like an important moment, I would say, is the first iteration of the revised text released by the chair, which was released barely an hour before plenary. And that I see it as a defining moment, because the plenary that followed after the first iteration, there was a clear division among like in the country reactions. Many countries were outraged with the text proposed, and they made very strong and sharp interventions expressing their disappointment in all the red lines that had been crossed. Whereas others for whom the text was perceived to be more favorable, they also expressed disappointment, but for like different reasons. And all of them had one reason in common, which was that Scope did not find a standalone article. So that sort of became the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. Just to conclude, I would say that I don't see it as a collapse, but like these things consume a lot of time, but I think with stronger and effective leadership and a lot more intersessional work, we can still definitely recover.
All right. Okay, so that was really, really interesting. All right, so time to get to a little more specific. And this time, this is basically the round 2 of the questions from my side. And I will request all the panelists to kind of restrict their interventions to about 5 minutes each. Let me again start with Bethany. Given your background, Bethany, what does the science tell us about the plastic and plastic pollution, why it is so much more important? And do you feel or do you agree that the negotiation reflects this urgency, or the politics or the geopolitics, if I may say, completely overshadowing this agenda of science?
Okay, in 5 minutes or less. So science can be useful in a few ways in this context. One, helping us understand the complexity of plastics as a material, then also helping us understand the complexity of plastics in its embeddedness in our cultures and societies and economies. It can also help us understand when and where and how pollution occurs, and what the consequences and costs of that pollution is. So if we start with that end of the conversation, we know that plastics are very complex materials. Most of them are made from fossil fuels, so their life cycle would, according to science, begin at extraction and production. And there are numbers of chemicals out there. We don't have extreme clarity on what's in plastics and products, but a report that came out last year put that number at around 16,000 different chemicals, and we know that 4,200 of those have hazardous properties that can have negative impacts in humans. And the releases that are occurring early in the life cycle include greenhouse gases, chemicals and particles, pellets, exposing the environment, but also exposing frontline and fence line communities and workers in the plastics life cycle. And as we move through the plastics life cycle into products that are being manufactured from these materials, sometimes in mixtures of materials, again with a lack of transparency about what is in them. Their exposures are occurring for, again, workers, but also consumers who are being exposed to chemicals to a large degree via food contact materials that are contaminating our foods, but also to particles. And then again, moving down the life cycle into the waste phase, where we know waste is managed more or less well in different parts of the world. It's treated and shipped and transported. It's released to the environment. A lot of it is either landfilled or dumped in the environment, or incinerated or burned openly in uncontrolled burns, again leading to exposures to humans, to the environment, of gases, of chemicals, of particles, of all of the above. That's the definition of where plastics pollution is occurring across the plastics life cycle. The scientific evidence also shows us of the impacts of the releases of all of these pollutants in the environment on a very large scale, on a planetary scale. We understand that plastics are connected to the triple planetary crisis, impacting climate change, impacting biodiversity loss, impacting pollution, obviously. And these have negative impacts in the environment and can have impacts in ecosystem services at very high costs to society. They're also impacting food safety and food security, among other things. So the environmental impacts are significant. Moving on to the human health side, the human health consequences of exposure to plastics chemicals is a field of science that has some decades behind it, and we have very robust and undeniable evidence that certain classes of chemicals used in plastics do in fact lead to significant health impacts at a cost of up to $1.5 trillion US per year via direct and indirect impacts, contributing to cancer, contributing to metabolic disorders like obesity and diabetes, contributing to endocrine disorders and impacts in reproductive health, child development, child brain development. So these are significant, and the burdens are not borne equally by all people across the planet. So this helps us understand where plastics pollution occurs and what the impacts are and what the costs are. Then science can also help us to find a path forward. Where might we need obligations? What sorts of articles, if you will, in the text would be necessary to achieve the goal of ending plastics pollution? Really central articles would be those looking at production and supply, looking at chemicals and plastics, looking at product design, and then of course all the way through to later stages in the plastics life cycle. But as you mentioned in the second part of your question, this is being discussed in a very geopolitical space where there are a lot of other interests involved. And we've, I'm sure, all seen the data and reports coming out on the amounts of lobbyists and the chemical industries, petrochemical industries that are participating in the meetings, both within the meeting rooms, but also exerting their influence outside of those spaces by lobbying governments, mostly referring to economies and the economies of the industry, though that's perhaps a longer conversation on the plastics chemical economy. What we do see a problem with is that the tactics that are commonly used to undermine science, that are used to create confusion and doubt amongst decision makers, so they feel uncertain or doubtful about where the truth lies and what the evidence actually says. And this can be done by producing their own reports, through academic capture, and the other techniques where they can sort of introduce other information, misinformation or disinformation into these spaces to create doubt. But they might also try to discredit academic studies or robust independent scientific studies so that they're not valued or there's some doubt about their validity by negotiators. And when that's not enough, they will try to silence scientists through harassment, intimidation campaigns. So all of these things, like the full gamut of all of these things, is happening in these spaces and outside of these spaces, which is making it more difficult for negotiators to know where the truth lies, and then maybe where the most powerful obligations would be in addressing the problems.
Very strong points. Thank you, Bethany. Let me just bring in Lars once again, even though Lars touched based on being someone who doesn't believe that Geneva was all doom and gloom. So, so my question to you, Lars, do you still think that the treaty is on track, or it could be brought on track, and we could still have a comprehensive life cycle instrument, or do you think that it is actually headed towards a weaker kind of a patchwork agreement? Your take.
Yeah, thank you, Atin, for the question. I think probably this treaty may not be as comprehensive as we would like it to be. I mean, that's the short answer to your question, and the reason for that lies in what we discussed earlier in terms of a consensus-based, sort of least common denominator based approach. Sadly, we do need a treaty that addresses the package that Siddharth explained, covering aspects of production, plastic products and chemicals of concern, product design, financing. So all of these aspects, need to be dealt with, if not now, then over time. Because if the agreement is only a sort of a waste management and recycling based agreement, like the first chair's text in Geneva, there is, it's not comprehensive enough, and it will not address plastic pollution to the extent that we need it to be. We also need to be able to strengthen the agreement over time, and that, as was explained earlier, it relates to how the conference of parties can be sort of made able to take decisions, clear decision-making mechanisms. But of course, all of that said, if this is an agreement that is not ratified by any of the major plastic producing countries, then it will also not be effective, because it will simply be an agreement between countries that are not really responsible for the problem. So this is the dilemma, and I think is one of the reasons why even some of the high ambition countries like my own, Norway, sort of continues to very carefully sort of nudge a consensus-based approach forward, even though that has its obvious shortcomings. So in summarizing this, sort of balancing between globally binding rules and nationally determined actions and contributions will be an art here. This is very delicate. The danger, of course, lies in a sort of Paris Agreement style treaty that leaves a lot of room for voluntary actions at the national level without clear global binding obligations and measures. That said, we have to have hope. I think my hope lies in the fact that most people want this problem solved, and we do not need to go into sort of complex questions around democracy. But I think the fact that we have a number of countries holding us back that are maybe not fully responding to the wishes and aspirations of their people is problematic here. But hope is the source of action and progress. So let's keep that hope. It's not over yet, but we definitely need somehow a change in dynamics of this process.
Thank you, Lars. Very important point, and especially your point on the consensus, which basically brings me to the next question to Siddharth. We had a lot of discussion around consensus, and especially if you remember in the INC2, you almost lost half the duration of the entire INC around discussions on the rules of procedure. So, and even in Geneva, we heard many observer groups, even some of the member states, of course, who were in favor of a high ambition treaty. They felt that the consensus has been weaponized in this negotiation process. Do you believe that the current rules of procedure are actually fit for the purpose, or do they actually stall the process and to kind of achieve kind of an ambitious treaty going forward? How do you see that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Atin. Just to clarify, while I focused on the negative parts in the first this thing, but I would also say that and agree with both Bethany, Lars, Madhu, and Chris that it's not all gloom and doom, right? In fact, for the very first time, I think in all the 6 rounds of INCs, we saw for the very first time that ambitious countries actually put their foot down, right? Saying that this is something that is absolutely not acceptable to us, which we have never seen in the past, right? So that's kind of, because this is something that, again, I heard a lot of people talking about, that, the frustration has to build in order to actually member states coming together and doing something about it. And I think we have at least tried to reach that level of frustration in this round of the negotiations, to see some action maybe the next time. As far as consensus is concerned, Atin, I think consensus has been traditionally and should be the cornerstone for decision making in such multilateral environmental spaces. But what we see, especially if I just look at it in the context of INCs, we see that there is a situation of deadlock and it's not moving, right? And in order to break such deadlocks, there has to be some pathways which the committee should have. I mean, these are avenues for making progress, right? And even if, let's say, I mean, INC does not have that capability, and I mean, it's willingly being blocked by a few, because consensus was never meant to be weaponized. I mean, the basic understanding is that countries come to this space and that they will negotiate in good faith. But when that faith goes out the window, this is what we experience, right? Now, if you if you look at a few other multilateral environmental agreements, and I say this with a rider that, I'm not an expert, but this is more in terms of what I've learned in my interactions with the community that we meet at INC, some of whom are here already, right? So if you compare multilateral environmental agreements that have been successful, right, they have had a provision for voting, right? You can look at Montreal Protocol, right? It achieved its goals much before the target year. It achieved its goals by spending a lot less than what was envisaged that it will cost, right? Because there was a provision to vote and move forward under any circumstances, right? Now, this I think there's other examples as well. There's Minamata, right? We've seen a lot of progress from where we started, but over the last 30 years, I would say we've seen a lot more multilateral environmental agreements without any decision making capacity. And that's why we also see a lot of MEAs turning ineffective. Like I mean, Lars did mention about the climate or the UNFCCC. I mean, we are struggling there, right? And I mean, because those set of decision-making capacities have been bracketed, right? And UNFCCC is not the only MEA that is going through this. There's Stockholm, there's Rotterdam, where consensus basically different countries take turns to use their veto power and say that this time we don't agree, right? So that just one country is not the villain every time, right? They take turns, and that's how they end up kind of delaying the entire thing. What could have been achieved in, let's say, a couple of years or 3 years takes 10, maybe more years, right? And I think that's exactly, most of the countries right now do realize that, and that is reflected in the Article 20 proposal put forth by Peru and Rwanda, which was supported by 120 countries, right? Nobody wants to be in this situation. And like you mentioned, Atin, we've all been through the trauma of, one single country, holding this entire process hostage for 2.5 days over, bracketing some text, right? So we've all been through that trauma, and countries do not want that to kind of repeat all over again. And they do realize that there's value in having the ability to vote. It's not about voting happening on every other aspect for every single reason. It's just that if we are caught in such a situation, we should have a provision to break this deadlock. And I think even the chair's latest proposal, I mean, even the chair did realize this towards the end, because he did, although with higher thresholds, introduce some kind of language on voting for the COP so that there can be progress. And if I link it to, Bethany talked about the science and the urgency, right? Science is telling us a lot of things, including the triple planetary crisis, but is also telling us that there is an urgent need for action, right? That urgency cannot be, I would say, it cannot be held back by consensus. But right now it is held back by consensus. So I would stop here and for you.
All right, strong points. Okay, so taking a cue from Siddharth's intervention, let me bring in Christopher. So right now we don't know what is going to be the future of this treaty, is because there is no further information available from the Secretariat, and it's too early to expect them as well. Now, looking at the issue of consensus and what we have experienced in Geneva, we know that if we stick to the consensus, even one country can stand up and hold the entire process hostage, right? And with our endeavor to achieve consensus, the ambition level of the treaty could get more and more diluted and compromised, like mentioned by Lars. So, in your opinion, what has to change? It's a member state-led process, of course. What has to change in the negotiating parties? I mean, I'm not getting into any specific group or regions. In your opinion, if we still be hopeful about getting a treaty with some degree of ambition still alive? Over to you, Christopher.
Thank you. And let me first say that, yes, a lot of things are uncertain. And Geneva, the UN headquarters in Geneva, was very big. So it's very useful to have this exchange with others who were there, because a lot of the negotiations were closed for observers. So through having this discussion, we also get some insights from people who have been speaking to other people who were in the room. So this is very good. Now, to be short, I think, pointing to two things that I think have to change to move forward. I think first, the modalities for the negotiations, and secondly, of course, the approach from significant member states as well. But to start with the first one, the additional days that we had in Geneva, or days and nights of negotiation time, they did not get us there. And the presence of a significant number of ministers and vice ministers did also not get us there. So as of today, I don't think the solution is to just add more negotiations time. I think there needs to be some new elements to try to solve this deadlock. And of course, NIVA doesn't have a fixed position on the modalities for the negotiations, but in my own capacity, based on experiences from other multilateral environment agreements, I think there needs to be a shift. And I think we all noticed in Geneva that the chair tried hard. The chair and the co-chairs tried really hard. And I think Ambassador Mayas tried even harder now than in Busan, but it wasn't a perfect hit. So maybe there is a need for a smaller group of countries to work together to try to identify what are the possible landing zones. But I think if they are to do this again, they would need, after the two not so successful attempts in Geneva, I think they would need a mandate maybe from someone else than the chair. At least the bureau, maybe a heads of delegation meeting. Not sure we should involve UNEA 7. That might open Pandora's box. But I think they would need a mandate and some trust from a larger group of countries to move forward, so that we don't start in the exact same matter next time the parties meet, because it's difficult to see how it would bring us forward. And then Madhu pointed out that a lot of the contact groups started with countries putting a lot of brackets in, and I think that would be, if we went down this road, that would happen again, because that is a little bit the nature of these negotiations. But when we negotiated the biodiversity, the global biodiversity framework, this helped between the second to final and the final meeting, that there was a group of experts. I think there were 27 who worked, and then after 2 days of fighting whether this should be the basis of negotiations or the previous draft, all the contact groups actually started with that draft, and that was helpful. But to go down that road, chair needs to know that when this text is presented, there will be a sufficient number of countries that also say that there's a lot of things that we disagree with in this document, but we are ready to move forward on it. Otherwise, it will not fly like in Geneva. And then when it comes to the member states, my second point, no matter how hard the chair and the contact group co-chairs try, we must recognize that the geopolitical situation and also the wish to find global solution has changed a lot from the post-COVID era in 2022 when UNEA 5.2 took place. And that makes it much more challenging to reach agreement today. So I think that's a little bit what Australia, I think it was, in the final plenary, they summarized this. The countries came to Geneva with a lot of red lines, and those red lines were simply incompatible. So if this is going to be, if there's going to be better chances for the next INC, if that is taking place, to deliver on the mandate, I think member states must also come to that INC with a better understanding of what is possible to achieve. And that means that the less ambitious countries must recognize that the ambitious countries cannot come home with a deal that does not all live up to the agreement, up to the mandate from UNEA. And the most ambitious countries must realize that this agreement will probably not solve everything. And then obviously there will be opportunities to do more, and I hope to come back to that if there is time for another question.
Very interesting. Yeah. So thank you, Christopher. So let me just turn to Madhu. Madhu, my question to you is, many developing countries argue that, without strong arrangement for finance capacity building and tech transfer, a treaty will just remain a treaty on paper. And in your opinion, what does a truly just and equitable transition look like in practice? I mean, given what we have been through in all the 6 rounds of negotiations that we have been a part of, and what risks do you see if these are sidelined?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Atin. So you mentioned finance, capacity building, and technology transfer. So as we may all be aware that these are 3 of the most important mechanisms and which form the backbone of this treaty. And therefore, how robust they are and like how ambitious these mechanisms are on paper will ultimately determine how effectively the treaty can be implemented and by whom. So before I share my thoughts on the question you just raised, I want to quickly for 30 seconds or so, just for the audience, give an outline of what was the finance discussion, the options rather. So the primary debate on finance in CG3 in contact group 3 was how what kind of a mechanism should be established to fund and finance the implementation of the treaty. So there were a few options on the table. One was a dedicated new multilateral fund designed and operationalized exclusively for this treaty. The other option was the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. And the third option, broadly speaking, was a hybrid of a combination of these two. Now, we saw that the donor countries wanted to retain GEF as the sole mechanism with the inclusion of some public-private partnership models, while many countries, many developing countries, including the African group, wanted a dedicated new multilateral fund, and they viewed it as the only way to guarantee a just transition. But there was a difference of opinion even amongst the developing countries on this point. For instance, the SIDS, taking into consideration the time and the complexity involved in designing and operationalizing a brand new fund, and it is no small feat, right? So considering all of these things, there were some other positions opting for the third option, which was a hybrid, open to a hybrid mechanism. Now, I'm going to pick up on something which Siddharth mentioned. So he mentioned that ambitious countries. It was refreshing to or it was good to see ambitious countries put their foot down this time strongly on substance. While I do agree with that on substantive provisions, ambitious countries put their foot down stronger. It was interesting for me to see how, I'm going to use quotes, how the high ambition quickly turned to low ambition when it came to discussions on finance. So now we've seen that donor countries, except the USA, have been highly ambitious on substantive provisions and scope. But when it came to walking the talk on financing, we could see that ambition fading away significantly. Now, I agree, this may not be a popular opinion. And there are also, it's not very as simple as saying high ambition turns low ambition when it comes to finance, because the whole point was I think the perception was, why would we pay for something which we've not agreed to? In the sense, if the substantive provisions are not there, why would we want to fund only a waste management treaty? So I get that, but it was still interesting, this observation, because we also saw countries that normally disagree on substance actually aligning on finance, because almost all of them fell under the developing countries category. Therefore, they shared similar frustrations about access and availability of resources, which was the main issue for them under finance. Now, to your question of how would we envision a just transition? Now, we take SIDS, the small island developing states, and LDCs, the least developed countries, are among the most vulnerable to plastic pollution while having contributed the least to the problem. We've seen this in every other environmental forums with climate change, etc. Therefore, without the right supporting mechanisms, which is predictable and adequate timely finance, which the mechanism being designed with the unique needs of SIDS and LDCs in mind, and not just SIDS and LDCs, but also the rights of frontline communities and indigenous peoples, and a meaningful capacity building and genuine, I want to say genuine technology transfer, because it shouldn't just end up being, technology being available for pilot projects, but it should also ensure equitable access to tools. And without these strong foundations and mechanisms, the burden of implementation will fall on SIDS and LDCs disproportionately. Now, this has been considered the special circumstances and needs of SIDS and LDCs has been the one of the red lines from the start, or a non-negotiable from the start, because it has SIDS and LDCs have been often grouped with economies in transition or the broader developing country bracket. Now, the problem with this grouping is that when SIDS and LDCs are lumped together with the wider developing country grouping, then their unique vulnerabilities, that gets diluted, and they all end up competing for the same limited pool of resources, compared to giant economies, like, for instance, like any, I don't want to name countries, but we can see, like, in terms of SIDS and China or India, the size of economies, I mean. So therefore, I would say, if we do not get this right, then we will only risk widening the implementation gaps further. And this will, this, because for the SIDS and LDCs, this is not just about classification, it is about and it's not just about ambition. This provision is about survival, because without dedicated and predictable, equitable support, we would, as you rightly said, we would risk designing a treaty that merely exists on paper. And not just that, a treaty which would deepen inequalities instead of actually solving them. I'll stop here, Zach.
Thank you, Madhu. A fresh perspective, to say the least. All right, it's time to wrap up before we open up the floor and take as many questions as we can. So I'll again turn back to all the panelists with a common question. What's next? We have seen Geneva, if we may all commonly call it a missed opportunity, staying a little more optimistic, like some of the panelists have mentioned. And even Christopher has reflected on this issue, that another INC may not be a good idea, right? So what the panel thinks largely, like where we are headed from Geneva. Are we predicting one more INC, or are we thinking that things should now better be handled by either UNIA or United Nations General Assembly, or we think that this process will continue and it would be influenced, and we'll eventually end up having a very compromised treaty, courtesy of a handful of countries basically who has been standing in between the ambition level. So over to you. I'll start with Bethany, about 2 to 3 minutes per panelist. Thank you.
Yeah, so as scientists working in this space, we're in a very walking a very narrow line in between science communication, science policy interventions, and avoiding being policy prescriptive, which is not our role here. So while I might have opinions on where we go from here, I don't really know. There's a lot of options on the table, and I know a lot of countries are exploring different ways, different paths forward. And as a number of the other panelists have already said, there are problems with the modalities of work, and these would need to be addressed in order to be more effective in future negotiations. But what we will continue doing is supporting member states with where the science is. And to be honest, this has been a conversation that has grown over time. The resolution itself was growing off of previous non-binding resolutions addressing marine plastic pollution, which was a very popular understanding of plastics pollution some years ago. But the resolution that we have now, Resolution 514, is much broader. It addresses the full life cycle. Scientists and others have helped bring the conversation to chemicals, to human health, to broaden our understanding of the impacts and then maybe the potential to address those harms. So we will continue doing that work. And over the years since the resolution's been adopted, the evidence has only grown stronger. And what we can also help do is help do horizon scanning, providing input on potential standards and criteria that could be developed, that could be applied in addressing chemicals of concern, in addressing products of concern, in advising or providing input into product design, amongst other things. And now I'm speaking from a very natural science perspective. We also have scientists that are working in social sciences that can provide input into other questions around a just transition, around how to protect people along the plastics life cycle, around how to protect human rights, given what we know. And another thing that's very important to remember is that as a society, humans have been very good at identifying problems and then replacing them with brand new problems. We've been quite bad at actually solving problems. We shift burdens and we solve maybe one part of a problem, but without a holistic, broad understanding of the drivers of plastics pollution, we risk finding solutions that, as Madhu was also explaining, can in fact cause more harm. So science can help us avoid that, help us find solutions that are truly safer and more sustainable. And as also other speakers have said, help countries find ways to include science in the future of the treaty. Hopefully it will be a tool that can be developed and improved over time as new evidence emerges, as new technologies and systems and infrastructures emerge, so that we can be responsive to changes over time. So that is what we will be doing, continuing to support member states and governments with this information and our understandings of the implications of science in the conversations that they're having.
Thank you, Bethany. Lars?
Yes, I mean, I wish I had a very good answer to your question, but I don't. We are in the same situation, all of us, I think. Bringing this issue to UNEA. Of course, UNEA is free to take up this issue if they want to, but I think that will be a bit of a recipe for even a worse situation. I mean, on the other hand, I do worry about the lack of an agreement, with regards to sort of UNEA 7 itself, because it really puts into, I mean, it's an example of the complex situation that we are in, geopolitically, and in the ability for multilateral spaces to sort of really address problems like this. And other than that, I think Grid Arendal, of course, we work very closely with UNEP. That doesn't mean that we have any insights in what is going on there, and it's not even up to the UNEP secretariat itself. This is a member state led process, and I think what I would hope for is another INC in a way, but with a different dynamic. So in other words, some things need to change between now and then, and change in a way that one actually makes a great deal of progress before reconvening at the future session. So we will also, just like Scientist Coalition and others, we will continue to support in any way that we can. Grid Arendal is also supporting with, in the science to policy space, assisting a number of delegations with technical advice in partnership with others. And we will continue to do that. We will also continue to do what I think will also be necessary, regardless of a treaty, to help address the problem and also address the problem in ways that the treaty will not be able to or not be sufficient, which is a likely case. So yeah, thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Lars. Siddharth.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest risks that we've been able to avoid is, the adoption of a weak treaty. None of us wanted that. And I think moving ahead, that fight will, kind of continue to happen. There will always be a super weak text that will be pushed down to the committee, and the pressure will only keep increasing from here, right? So that fight of kind of not accepting a weak text, that would continue. We saw kind of a glimpse of it this time as well. In terms of what are the other options, like everyone else, your guess is as good as mine, right? But for UNIA, I think UNIA is planned for December this year, right? So there definitely is going to be some stock taking on what is the progress. But unfortunately, UNIA, as far as I know, does not have the capacity to vote, just like the INC, right? So there's also the provision of taking this discussion to the General Assembly, where there is a provision to vote, right? And it can actually break that stalemate that we are in, because even if we meet for the 10th INC, and countries continue to dig their heels deeper into, the positions that they've been kind of holding on to for the last 5 meetings, I don't think it's going anywhere, right? So we really need some force, some nudge, which basically helps us to break this deadlock right now that we are in. The other option is also, all of us have been hearing about the coalition of the willing. Some have started to call it the coalition of the consuming countries, right? Because the coalition of willing has a slightly different history as well. So you can also read about that. But a lot of emphasis is also being right now put on how can these majority group of countries who may not be producers but are impacted by plastic pollution, and because of the situation we are in, are also consumers of plastic. So how can some action be taken by these group of countries, right? That's also something on the table, which I think could be and should be explored going forward. So yeah, that's all I can think of right now. Back to you.
All right. Okay. Christopher, quick reflection, even though you have mentioned it in your reflection earlier.
I think there should be another INC because, well, it shouldn't end like this. That would be a sad blow for multilateralism. But what I said was that I don't know if the member states have patience to continue with the modality that we had in the previous meeting. But then we should also remember that the time frame in the beginning was very optimistic. I would say very optimistic if we compare to other processes. And if I think back to when the what was supposed to be the Copenhagen Climate Accord, which completely collapsed in 2010, there was a deadlock in those negotiations as well until Paris in 2015. The benefit in that process was that there was already a COP for the framework convention, so that although those negotiations were very frustrating, at the same time there was a framework for cooperation on science. There was a framework for global finance mechanisms. So there was a whole setup that was also supporting the buildup of ambition and making an understanding of what is possible. And then I know many would say this was not perfect, but at least it's what we could get in that setting. The challenge with the INCs is that we don't have all those positive moments happening in parallel to the negotiations at the moment. But that said, we also know that there is a growing number of countries that take responsibility, that take action at home. So with the support from all the scientists, many of them represented in the Scientist Coalition, many of those are working at our institutes. I think the understanding will grow, the pressure from the public will hopefully grow, so that the more action countries need to take at home, the more likely it is that they will also come to these negotiations and try to create the necessary international framework. So that is my positive take on it. And I think it's important that the countries that have high ambitions, that they continue working also outside this framework. It's a challenge which will influence the negotiations going forward as well, that with the closure of USAID, almost 1/3 of available public development finance globally disappeared. So there is a need for this work to find other streams of finance as well, because the competition for that public aid will be very hard also for the years to come. But there are, I think I will close with that there is always the option to do more than what the treaty will say on the domestic level and together. Then there is many reasons that would not be ideal, but it's important that what we get in the future will have an opportunity to be strengthened over time.
Thank you, Christopher. Okay, Madhu.
Yeah, I echo Christopher's views to some extent. I do want to say that I'm not an expert on treaty processes yet. I would like to get there someday. But so after talking to some colleagues and actual experts on treaty processes and former negotiators, I know that we have a few options on the table. I hope we don't have PTSD from hearing few options on the table, but so while I wouldn't know if this is the preferred and best option, I do see that like as Christopher mentioned, convening another INC would also comes with its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage being that we can at least keep the discussions within the same forum or within the same mandate, while not necessarily the same modality, as Christopher again mentioned. So I would say this would avoid a total reset of all the efforts that have gone into this process and all the money that has gone into this process so far. So one option is to have another INC with the chair coming up with a clean text, but more importantly, coming up with a much better planning in terms of modality and how these things will go. And another option, which I think Siddharth mentioned about the Minamata Convention. So I learned from a colleague that Minamata used intersessional groups and additional sessions to land a deal, because I think it was also mainly about debracketing the finance section of it. So that is where it showed that intersessional work was useful in that. So I don't think it should be just a linear, just this, after this comes this, but it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And again, it was, so yeah, I think Siddharth also mentioned about going to UNEA and then the UNGA. So with UNEA, in my understanding, I think we can maybe seek guidance or clarity on the scope and the timeline. For instance, if we want to have another INC, it can't just be an indefinite, like one after another thing. So maybe we can go to UNEA to get more clarity on scope and also have a controlled extension of the mandate saying not just 5.234 or 6, but a controlled extension. Going to UNGA, again, I would love to be corrected if my understanding is wrong about this. But going to UNGA, I'm sure we could adopt a declaration which can increase or maintain the political momentum that we have right now. But I'm not sure if it would create a binding regime on plastics itself, like having a vote which directly reflects on the outcomes or the results of what's happening here in the deadlock. So yeah, I see that these are some of the options. And apart from this, we also have our, I think, to hash out the core points of divergence, we need to have more ministerial or high level or just different explore alternative pathways to sort of have breakthroughs on these particular core to detangle the knots, the political knots, I would say. And just as to like a few words to end with on an optimistic note, like going back to your first question, I don't think the process is broken yet. We are definitely at a very, very crucial crossroads, but I think the next few months will be critical because we all have seen and learned that it's not just about what happens during INCs. It has much more to do with what happens before and after these INCs. So I think our immediate goal should not be or need not necessarily be to go directly looking for that common ground, say on scope or production or whatever it is. But instead, I think if we focus on getting the process right, explore alternative pathways to design a process which can sustain and overcome the deadlocks on its own with a nudge here and there. And I think that is possible only with better planning, stronger leadership, and greater flexibility, of course, and political will. So I think with all of this, we do have a chance to land an ambitious treaty. I'll stop there.
All right. Okay. So let's keep the hope alive. It was fabulous. I mean, fascinating discussion to say the least. We have very little time left, about 3 minutes precisely. If all the panelists agree, I can take your permission to add another 5 minutes to it, to take few more questions from the participants and direct them to whosoever it is relevant to. And if I may request Sid to please take few questions that we can see in the Q&A box, because there is nothing in the chat box I've checked.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Atin. I have tried to answer most as in my capacity. I'm not sure if, but yeah, I see some questions on chemicals, and I would like to direct them to Bethany. And there's one more question that I would keep open-ended. Bethany, this one's for you. It says the number of chemicals is increasing with every INC. If any competent body would do an honest survey to find out how many of the commonly littered plastic contains how many bad chemicals. For instance, would a littered carry bag contain any hazardous chemicals, or would a plastic water bottle contain those chemicals? So Bethany, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, happy to answer. So in terms of the number of chemicals that are in plastics, there's a report that came out a few years ago putting that number at 10,000, and that was from a scientific study by academic scientists trying to scrape as much available data as possible. And then the BRS, UNEP, and some others put together another report a few years later, putting that number at 13,000. And then academic scientists and others published the PlastChem report, which has recently been published in Nature, putting the number at 16,000. Where 4,200 of those chemicals are known to have hazardous properties. And these are listed as chemicals that are present or used in plastics. They might be used in production, but not present in the final product, or they might be degradation products or so-called NIASs, non-intentionally added substances. But one important takeaway from our understanding of this is that this number is increasing, and that's probably due to two factors. One is chemical proliferation, so like increasing the numbers of chemicals that are created and registered for sales or for production globally increases, but our access to information might also be increasing. But it also points to a problem around transparency, where there are very, very few requirements for publicly reporting what is used and in plastics products. This information is not available. It's not available to actors across the plastics value chain. It's not available to regulators. It's not available to consumers. And this is a very big problem in trying to manage and mitigate the harms of plastics because we don't know what's in them. And it's also problematic when we come to recycling, for example, where plastics are being mixed in complex waste streams, and there's potential for contamination, and products being made from recycled plastics that contain chemicals that are not safe for use in their second iteration. Plastics are also known to sorb chemicals, so because of their hydrophobic nature, so chemicals can sorb into the plastics matrix during the use phase. And my research group has found pharmaceuticals and pesticides and other chemicals in recycled plastics, which further indicates the complexities of trying to manage these and doing anything in a safe and circular, non-toxic manner. To date, it's not been possible. So those are to answer some of your questions. When it comes to littered plastic items, there are a number of studies looking at this, but analytical chemistry to do this is expensive and time-consuming, and definitely not methodologies that are widely available. A number of studies do look at, for example, recycled PET that is used in food contact materials, and even that relatively closed loop system of a relatively simple plastic material is also shown to increase in toxicity over recycling cycles. So the toxicity issue is one that is significant and difficult for us to address or manage in the current landscape of complexity and policies. If that was a good enough answer to that question.
I think with the limited time that you have, I'm sure you have a lot more to share. But with the limited time, I think that's very important. And I see Christopher has already answered the next question that we had. So just utilizing this time, there's also this question on how can science basically be used to inform negotiators, and what are the areas that we should be looking at? I mean, this is an open question to any of you who may want to kind of come in. What are the areas which need to be looked at, and how can we use that information to convince about the urgency, right, of this?
I'm putting my hand up. I don't see anyone else's yet, so I'll answer quickly and see if someone else wants to join. So I mentioned some of the areas of science that we're working with. Some of it's around environmental impacts of plastics, but we also need to look at the social and economic impacts of plastics and shifts as we move away from the problematic chemical substances and infrastructures that we have in place today. We need to understand both the emissions, the fate, the impacts of plastics pollution, but solutions-oriented work. And this is, again, the future. So this is work that is a bit predictive, and we'll need to evaluate and changes as they're occurring or implemented. But we need to make sure that what we're doing does not result in, as I said earlier, burden shifting or creating new problems. So it will require a holistic understanding of the studies to be done. And so science is definitely important here, and taking a sort of Western academic understanding of what science is, academic independent science is important, but it would also be important to include other knowledge systems in these evaluations, especially if we're talking about developing standards and criteria for assessing essential use, for example, or safety and sustainability of chemicals and products and systems. And so Indigenous knowledge holders, rightful knowledge holders, frontline and fence line communities, people with lived experiences would need to have input into these conversations to make sure that we're doing something that is robust, evidence-based, implementable, fit for purpose, contextually relevant, culturally relevant. There's a lot of different aspects that can be addressed here. Muting so other people can join.
Thanks, Bethany. Any other thoughts, Lars? I
Just
see
very
you.
quickly, I mean, Bethany has put it very well. I think one particular aspect that is challenging at the moment is to separate truth from not truth. So, in other words, I mean, really sort of holding down the fort or sort of promoting independent academic science from more the type of scientific studies that are often financed by industry and so on. So that's something that we also focus a lot on in our support to negotiators. Thank you.
Piggybacking on Lars really quickly, we would say that it's very important to have strategies to mitigate conflicts of interest in the kinds of evidence that is being used in decision making, and especially as a future subsidiary body is formed, that those strategies will need to be very strong, and there will need to be strong requirements on transparency, both on who's participating and on what kinds of data and information are being used.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Bethany. Thank you for bringing that up. Christopher, Madhu, any final words before I hand it over back to Atin, actually? Chris, Madhu. Okay, so I'm taking that as a no. Over to you, Atin. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, colleagues, for allowing us to extend the time by about 5 minutes and answer those questions. I don't think we have any pending questions, at least in the Q&A box. It has been a fascinating discussion, to say the least. Of course, we are in no position to predict what is going to happen, but I mean, given our backgrounds and our association with the entire journey of the Global Plastic Treaty, we could have a very practical guess based on evidences and facts that we basically have been through. I mean, I can't thank you all enough. Of course, we will continue to work together, continue to stay in the same community, and we all would keep our fingers crossed to not lose hope and still expect that this treaty will pretty much deliver what it was set out to be. A big shout out to NIVA, if I may name Amy Nokelbai and Swati Sambial from Grid Arendelle, because we teamed up to do this entire series and we couldn't have done it without their support. Thanks to all the participants. I mean, it was fabulous the way, I mean, today, I mean, because of our kind of late outreach, the number was slightly less, but then we still got, I mean, this is being live streamed as well. So a lot of colleagues are watching us in all social media platforms. And we also designed a very strong campaign page, kind of, which we called it kind of Plastic Over Planet, and inside the Global Plastic Treaty. Planet over Plastic. Sorry. I keep fumbling around this thing because it's very confusing.
Yeah.
And I have shared the link, and we have loads and loads of stories by us, by other colleagues. We have our reports, the country position report that we released just ahead of the INC. So thank you all so much from the core of our hearts. We will definitely continue to follow how this unfolds going forward, and we'll look forward to stay in touch with all of you. And hopefully, wherever it takes place, the next INC, we again keep our fingers crossed that we will not miss the bus again. Thank you all. Thank you all the panelists. Thanks to all the participants who are joining us virtually. Thank you so much. Please take care and stay safe.
Bye. Thanks.